Obergefell?
Senator, I would have followed binding precedent.
You're not answering my question. Would you have reached the same conclusion?
Senator, the conclusions that the two precedents reached were potentially in conflict, and I would have to follow the precedent that...
So you can't tell us at this point whether you would have reached the same conclusion as the Supreme Court in Obergefell. So let me ask you about the Supreme Court's decision in Lawrence affirming a constitutional right to be intimate among same-sex couples.
Adam Schiff just got humiliated on live television, and the media doesn't want you to see it. This Democratic senator walked into this confirmation hearing with one goal: manufacture a gotcha moment, force a viral clip, and destroy a perfectly qualified judicial nominee. It didn't work. Every trap backfired. Every pressure tactic collapsed. And when this nominee dropped that one line about his own interracial marriage, Schiff's entire strategy crumbled in real time. That is the radical left's playbook exposed in broad daylight, and we are breaking down every second of it. Like this video right now. Subscribe if you're new, and stay to the end because the full breakdown is going to leave you fired up.
So let me ask you, the Emoluments Clause provides that no person holding public office shall accept any present of any kind, whatever, from any king, prince, or foreign state. Do you believe the language in the Emoluments Clause that says any present of any kind, whatever, means any present of any kind, whatever?
Senator, you are quoting the text of the Emoluments Clause, and I cannot dispute with the text of the Emoluments Clause.
So it would apply to any present, including an airplane?
It would apply to the president, I believe, your Senator.
And I take it as an originalist, you would accept that the founders would have never subscribed to the idea that a president in their time could have accepted a multi-hundred-million-dollar gift from a foreign state.
Senator, the premise of your question implicates live issues in the public and pursuant to the canons of judicial ethics.
Well, let me just ask you, would the founders have believed that if a president received 100 camels from a foreign state, that was an emolument?
Senator, it's difficult to answer that question in the
Is it, though, as an originalist? Isn't it pretty simple? You've got the clear language of the Constitution.
Senator, one has to look at the language, but also the history surrounding the Emoluments Clause in order to discern.
I am looking at the history. Let me move on to another question. As an originalist, do you believe that the Obergefell versus Hodges decision affirming constitutional right to same-sex marriage, was that wrongly decided?
Senator, Obergefell versus Hodges is binding precedent of the Supreme Court.
I'm aware of that. Do you believe it was wrongly decided?
Senator, as a circuit judge, I would be bound to follow
I understand that, but that's not responsive to my question. Had you been on the Court of Appeals prior to that decision, would you have decided the case that way?
Senator, prior to Obergefell versus Hodges, there was a prior Supreme Court case addressing the issue, and I would have followed that case.
Well, would you have reached the same conclusion as the Supreme Court in Obergefell?
Senator, I would have followed binding precedent.
You're not answering my question. Would you have reached the same conclusion?
Senator, the conclusions that the two precedents reached were potentially in conflict, and I would have to follow the precedent that...
So you can't tell us at this point whether you would have reached the same conclusion as the Supreme Court in Obergefell. So let me ask you about the Supreme Court's decision in Lawrence affirming a constitutional right to be intimate among same-sex couples. Do you believe that was wrongly decided?
Senator, Lawrence versus Texas is a binding precedent of the Supreme Court.
Again, I'm aware of that, but I'm asking you whether you believe that was rightly decided or wrongly decided.
Senator, you're asking about my personal views.
No, I'm asking you about your legal views. I'm asking about your legal views. Let me ask you about another case. Do you believe that Loving versus Virginia, which affirmed an interracial couple's right to marry, was that wrongly decided?
Senator, my wife and I are an interracial couple, and so if that case were wrongly decided, I would be in big trouble.
Okay, so you do agree with the reasoning of that case, and you're willing to say that. I appreciate that. But you're unwilling to say that you agree that Obergefell and Lawrence were correctly decided. Why is that?
Senator, again, those decisions are binding precedent of the Supreme Court, and I would be bound to follow.
I'm aware of that. So is Loving. and you're willing to tell us that you believe Loving was correctly decided, but you're not willing to say the other decisions were correctly decided. That seems less originalist and more situational. Let me ask you this about your role in the brief in Moore versus Harper. This was a case involving the discredited independent state legislature theory, which would allow a state legislature, even in the absence of a governor's signature, to effectively overturn an election. Do you believe that the Supreme Court wrongly decided Moore v. Harper when it rejected your view?
Senator, again, Moore v. Harper is binding precedent of the Supreme Court.
Yeah, no, I get that, but you're still not answering my question. So let me ask you a different way. If a state legislature decided after an election to pass a bill, even in the absence of a governor signing it, to throw out absentee ballots that were mailed prior to the election but arrived after the election, would it be your view that a state Supreme Court or federal court would have to allow the legislature to overturn the election, would be powerless to correct that effort to overturn a free and fair election?
Let's be absolutely clear about what just happened. Adam Schiff did not come to that hearing to evaluate a judge. He came to run a loyalty test. He came to extract political promises from a man about to sit on the federal bench, and when he couldn't get them, he threw a slow-motion tantrum in a suit. That is the Democrat playbook in its purest, most shameless form. This nominee was flawless. Every single time Schiff pushed, the nominee held the line. Binding precedent, judicial restraint, constitutional process. Over and over, calm and immovable. That is exactly what you want in a federal judge. That is the opposite of what Democrats want, because what they want is an activist on the bench who will rubber stamp their agenda and call it law. And the Loving moment? That moment told you everything. Schiff spent the entire hearing screaming that the nominee wasn't answering questions. But the second the nominee gave a personal answer about his own marriage, his own life, Schiff folded instantly and moved on. No follow-up. No, that's not responsive. Nothing. Because it was never about getting answers. It was about getting the right answers, the politically approved, pre-selected, left-wing approved answers. The moment that strategy got exposed, Schiff had nowhere left to go. This is what the radical left does to good people who dare to serve this country outside their ideological permission structure. They drag them into hearing rooms, demand they audition for Democratic approval, and when those nominees refuse to surrender their independence, they call it evasion. It is not evasion. It is integrity. And Washington hasn't seen enough of it in a very long time.